Hi everyone, this is Mo Volans back for audiotuts.com, and today we're looking at mastering, more specifically solving problems in mastering. So let's say you can't go back to a mix and you've got an export, or render and or a mixdown, whatever you want to call it, and there's inherent problems in it. I'm going to run through a few tutorials over the coming weeks that focus on specific problems and at least one way you can go around sorting them out. Today, we're looking at masters that are perhaps a bit dull in sort of frequency or, tonality, that maybe they've been mixed on headphones or in a, less than ideal environment or in a rush, and they've maybe not got enough high end or, high mids. Or maybe there's other issues, like bottom end, but we're really just going to be looking at sort of rescuing masters that just aren't quite right. Obviously, if there's serious problems with the master or the mix, the pre-master, then you might want to think again. But in this specific situation, the client that I was working with really couldn't get back to the mix. Files had been lost or whatever, and this is what we had to work with. It was 24-bit. It wasn't trimmed down too hard. The balance in the mix was okay for me, and generally the mix was pretty powerful. The only real problem with it was that it's a bit dull. It hasn't got quite a lot of high end and hasn't got that much high end, sorry. And it's not just a case of whacking a single EQ over it. I mean, you can do that, but things generally sound pretty hyped if you do that. They're going to sound pretty nasty and tinny. So let's have a listen to the body of the mix. And this is without any processing. This is at unity gain as it was sent through in 24-bit stereo. And I'll just play you back sort of the main body of the mix here. So it just sounds a bit muffled, but the sort of the relative balance of the elements in the mix to me is fine. The power's there, the dynamics are there, and the stereo image is there. There's even enough bottom end to work with, but we just need to enhance the high end. So let's take a look at a typical chain that helps you do something like this. Don't worry too much about the specific plugins. You can always replace them as long as you're using something of decent quality. So first up, I always do this in a mastering chain. Probably comes from working, back from working on analog consoles, but I like to insert a bus compressor straight away. It's the first thing I like to do. Gets things nice and uniform, adds a bit of cohesion to the mix, and generally tames the low end a little bit, I find. Obviously, if you're lacking low end, it might be a bit of an issue to do this, but in this case, we're lacking high end and there's a lot of bottom end. So this should help to some extent even things out a little bit, both dynamically and the tonality of the mix. So I'll play you again the main section, and you can see that I'm just using sort of a moderate attack, reasonably fast release, probably a little slower than I usually use, and a sort of a low ratio. So pretty moderate settings, and I think I'm going for about 3 decibels of reduction. I'll play it back from this section here. I'll also bypass it so you can hear the difference. It's very subtle. Hear the bottom end flailing around a little there. And I find that just focuses it. So in. Out. It's all about small changes, really. It's all about the last 5%. In this case, probably more like 15%. But as we build up these layers of changes, these composite layers within the mastering chain, we should get towards where we want to be. So don't worry. Don't try and make large changes with any single processor. You'll end up chasing your tail and pushing things too hard. So the next processor I'm going to use, and this is pretty important for me at least, when you're attacking, specific frequency zones and specific areas, is multi-band processing, because you can transparently affect individual bands within your mix without touching the rest. Whack an EQ across the mix, and you could end up coloring areas that you you don't want to touch. In this case, I wanted to work in the high mids and especially sort of the high psychoacoustic frequency, the very high end. Realistically, this is 2 bands of high mid, the top one being high mid to those higher frequencies, and the second one being sort of what we're looking at here, 1.39k to 2.86k, so sort of your high mid area. And this is a little mastering trick that I like to use. I've seen other guys use it as well, where you use a multiband to boost a certain frequency and then use the reduction to reduce down to 0. And it's sort of like a reactive EQ, really, like a dynamic EQ. And you can see that I've not mixed this in at 100%. So any multiband compressor or dynamic EQ should be able to do this for you. I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to make it a little more extreme. Let's take the bypass off, might help. And you can see they're just being tickled, these areas, and they're going back down to 0. So what I'm doing is I'm hyping the specific area using the gain. You can hear all that high end there, and then using the threshold combined with the ratio to take it back down to 0. So that's an extreme version of what I'm doing here. Obviously you probably wouldn't want to apply that much, but I'm going to take the gain back down. You see, that's reducing it too much. So let's bring the threshold back down. I'm just going to play the body back again. So I probably want to be adding like 1 to 2 decibels of equalization essentially. And I like nice low ratios during mastering. And you can see that I'm using the threshold now to take the reduction, use the reduction to take that back down to 0. Now what this does is it generally adds EQ in the area. You can hear a slightly hyped result if I bypass this. We are adding high end, but we're not adversely affecting the dynamics, and we're keeping things tamed in those areas. So you can do this with low end and you can do this with mid, whatever's lacking, and you can even use it the opposite way. So you can reduce and increase. So rather than increase and reduce, if you see what I'm saying. So you can do a polar opposite version of this if you need to do the opposite. So once you've got your settings, exactly how you want them, I'd probably go ahead and adjust this a little more. You can mix this in. Let me just increase the gain of this band slightly. You can mix this in using sort of parallel processing, I guess, to some extent. And I think I used about 70% to let some of the dry signals seep through. And we're already starting to increase that high end. So let's have a listen. That's with the processors. I've been trying to listen to you guys. You said that I don't spend enough time A-Bing, so here it is. And without. So we're already enhancing that high end, but just gradually, at each stage. And I find this works better, much, cascading processors rather than just hammering one processor generally gets hype sounds. Now, here's a really high quality mastering EQ. Well, at least the hardware version is. I really like this software version. I've used the Massive Passive in the real world, if you like, and I find that, it's pretty much the same result. Sounds very similar anyway. I've used 2 bands here to boost a fair amount of EQ on the high end and mid range, high mid range at least. I've also used the high pass filter to go up to 16 hertz, right down at the low end to take some of the unwanted subs away if there are any. I just do that as a safety precaution, really, to allow the final limiter to breathe. But you can get away with these analog model EQs with adding quite a lot of EQ before it sounds boosted and before it sounds hyped and overcooked. So let's have a listen to this. And there's quite a lot here. This is a shelf and this is a bell with sort of very low Q. So we're working with large, broad brush strokes. So let's play that body back again with it in. and without. And it's really just adding air. So although that looks like quite a lot of EQ, in a tracking EQ it would be, but these mastering EQs, they're obviously, the name gives it away, it's a passive EQ. It's pretty subtle and it's very transparent, and it's most importantly what we call musical. Okay, so it works in conjunction and, you know, in a symbiotic relationship with your music. It's not going to sound hyped and horrible and digital. It should sound organic. And I find that you can get away with quite high gain levels on these if needed, in situations like this. Next up, I don't want to spend all day going through this, because we'll have a 25-minute video here, but there's some mid-side processing, and really I'm using this to mono out the low end. So this mono maker down here is very useful. I'm enhancing the stereo information in the mix very slightly, and I think there's a little bit of presence shift, which is sort of an enhancer on the mono information. And there's a little bit of high mid EQ here, like 0.9. In fact, we could probably get away with a little less on the stereo information. So the effects returns, you know, the stereo, since the stereo percussion is being EQ'd slightly there, very, very slightly. So with that in, again, very subtle. We're making sure that low end's focused, and we're starting to brighten things up. Now, this is optional, but if you need to introduce even more high end, and this is really psychoacoustics, because we're right up at 40 kilohertz here. And, you know, this is essentially past, past human hearing, I guess. 20 kilohertz would be considered sort of, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz would be considered, the human hearing range. And above that, it's psychoacoustic. It's, dog whistle territory. But I think that by adding some of this, you do get an effect. It does add air, hence it being called the air band. And it adds some kind of sort of subliminal or subconscious clarity. I don't know. Okay. We're talking about 2 decibels here. Without. With. Depends what's with, sorry. Really depends what speakers and headphones you're listening on, I guess, and whether, you've got the hearing ability of a dog. I mean, you can take this down to 20 kilohertz, and it'll become more apparent if I increase this band. You can really hear that. There's 40 without, and let's boost it all the way to the top. I mean, you can hear it. Obviously, there's some kind of shelving algorithm in there, so you're probably getting less than 40. But there's that layer. And then finally, we can go ahead and boost it. Now, my client wanted this super loud. So don't kill the messenger. Personally, I probably wouldn't limit it as much as this, but reasonably fast attack, moderate release, 3, 4, 5 decibels of reduction possibly, and it's pretty loud. Let's take the processors off. In fact, I'll leave the limiter on, and you can hear sort of the difference at a matched level, more or less. So there's the original. And I'll switch the processors on one by one. So hopefully what we've done is organically boosted the high mids and the high end. And it should still sound pretty good in the breakdowns. So there you go, and we felt by the end of that had been rescued. It didn't have to be remade or recreated. And hopefully it's shown you some techniques you can use to boost the higher frequencies in your mix without going well over the top and without making it sound hyped. You can use any combination of these. You can use them together. You can use them alone. They're really just different techniques to do the same thing without, loading any one processor too hard. So let me know if it's been helpful to you, if you agree with it, if you disagree with it, if you use a different process, let us know. And I'll also be looking at maybe some low-end issues and some stereo issues in masters and how to rectify these as we go on. Cheers.